Scott Macmillan is a musical monster, instrumentalist, composer, conductor, arranger, impresario, and teacher. He's married to the remarkable Jennyfer Brickenden, manager, organizer, businesswoman, and collaborator. He seems equally at home with jazz and gospel and Celtic and classical forms, but for me, his most powerful and engaging work fuses Celtic melody with classical structure. You can see a complete performance of his splendid Celtic Mass for the Sea on the Green Interview website. Jennyfer wrote the libretto based on ancient Celtic poems and prayers which exuberantly celebrate the life of the waters covering our planet. Our conversation focused on the making of the piece and its remarkable worldwide acceptance.
Gaelic isn't trivial. It's as ancient and as important as the Greek and the Roman, although it was an oral culture, so it wasn't a written culture. So that may explain why people think it's a little less important. Many of these melodies are common today. If you're involved with Celtic music, you would recognize these melodies.
So you tapped into a huge treasure trove and really only were able to use a small amount, only needed a small amount, really.
Oh, yeah, a huge treasure trove, and really fortunate because I think since I did that in '88, the universities have sort of, in Nova Scotia, have sort of highlighted their libraries. Like now St. Mary's has the whole Irish collection, so I don't know if it would be as successful as I was then when all the collections were all in one place.
And you're telling me that the Carmichael went out there after 8 centuries,
Yeah.
and people still had these ancient Celtic poems, prayers, incantations, and so forth, preserved orally for 8 centuries.
For 8 centuries, yeah, I think so. And I think with the oral traditions, I know that in the storytelling tradition, they would gather people together, and they would often cite a young person, and that person may be taking an interest in a story, and they would give that person the story. So they would learn these stories, and they would learn them verbatim. They weren't arbitrary. They weren't like sort of, I went down the street and I saw so-and-so, and then I passed that on to you, and then you went down the street and saw somebody else. These were very, very intact. And so I would assume that the incantations and prayers would also be kept intact. Like many oral traditions, we find that with Native communities. We find that all over the world where oral traditions are passed on very, very succinctly from one generation to the next.
Yeah, and very carefully unchanged.
Very carefully unchanged.
Like they are literary texts, and they're just as fixed as a written text.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate the way we've used the word illiterate, which has been applied to many of these cultures, because really illiterate just means unlettered. It makes you realize that people knew things instinctively and looked around themselves and knew how fragile their existence was in relationship to the food that they could acquire either by land or by sea, and that without that give and take, then they put themselves in a much more precarious situation.
We've been here a long time, and sometimes we've been paying attention. Scott, let me turn to the second big word, which is Mass. And I think many of us are familiar, or think we are, with forms like sonata and symphony and other similar concerto and so on. But Mass doesn't seem nearly so familiar. What is a Mass? What is a musical Mass?
Well, if a person wants to compose a Mass, they have to have 5 movements. They need a Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and an Agnus Dei. Got to have those 5. And then within that, there's a procedure called trope, which essentially you can open it up and add other things. And tropes were used a lot through Renaissance times, where you could, in between, have another movement, because if you have the 5, you can call it a Mass.
But the Mass form actually reflects the religious Mass, right? I mean, the structure of the musical Mass is based on the structure of the liturgy?
Yes, and Jennyfer and I, we discovered a little book called Understanding the Mass. It was a little leaflet in the back of the church, and it was really nice that we found that, because it defined the prayers. The Gloria says this, the Credo says this, like actually in in a sentence. Jennyfer made choices. She had all of those words. She chose those pages. Those were the ones that we are left with. And I made choices of how to spin that music off to make those lines. But I was ready to see them and hear them, and then I chose that one and that one.
Scott Macmillan and Jennyfer Brickenden, composer and librettist of the magnificent Celtic Mass for the Sea. If you enjoyed this interview, you may also want to look at our interviews with painter Robert Bateman and poet Brian Brett. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.